All right, we're back. Hello again, everyone. My name is Cashin Yu, and I will be hosting today's event. Just to get us started, we are bringing you this webinar today through a grant from the Office of Community Services. The Community Action Partnership does run the Risk Mitigation Training and Technical Assistance Center. So in addition to maintaining the CSBG TNTA Resource Center, we also create and promote tools and webinars of critical interest to the network. All of our recordings and presentations are available in the Resource Bank section of the CSBG TNTA Resource Center, which is found at www.csbgtta.org. So I'll do the briefest of introductions to today's speaker, 4 exits from the top. We have with us Don Tebby, who is consultant and author on executive succession and transition. He has helped over 100 organizations plan CEO succession, recruit leaders, and manage organizational change. He is the author of several different books, including Chief Executive Transitions, How to Hire and Support a Nonprofit CEO, and the website lifeafterleadership.com, which is devoted to helping executives plan their move to the next chapter. Would like to note that earlier in his career he was Deputy Director at the Illinois Community Action Association, so he does have CSBG in his blood a little bit. So with that, we're going to take it away, Don, and let's get started.
Thanks, Cashin. Really delighted to be joining you all today and kind of coming back home a little bit. Had the opportunity to work with the partnership for several occasions over the years, and enjoyed staying in touch and kind of keeping up with what's happening in the network. And so I was really delighted to have the opportunity to join you today and share some ideas about how you can have a more successful transition. And so to start off with, I think we have a poll to kind of get a sense of who all is on the call. So if you're an agency CEO or a senior executive, other staff member, board member, consultant, if you just could pop over there to that poll on the right and click in, that will help me kind of tailor my remarks, because we go a lot of different directions with this discussion, and I want to make sure that it's really hitting home for you.
Yes, and that poll question is open on that right side panel. We have several people that have already put answers in, and you do have a few more seconds in which to get your answers, and then we will share that back out with the group. All right, our poll is officially closed, and you should be able to see results.
Oh, well, it looks like about half of you are agency directors, and the other half are kind of split between other or choose not to answer. So, and hey, I realize that what we're talking about today is sensitive topics, and so confidentiality is assured here, and so we're not going to ask you to disclose your name or disclose yourself. But so just rest assured around that. Well, why don't we go ahead and start to dig in before we get into the content, though. What I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you a little bit of context about where these ideas came from. I'm about to share with you. As Cashin said, for the past 20 years, I've been helping nonprofit organizations lead chief executive successions, transitions, other senior management transition as well. And I've watched a lot of leaders transition out of this, retirements, move on to other positions, some of them have moved very gracefully into the next chapter of life, and others have really struggled with it, and recognize that these transitions are a challenge for everyone at some level. That really has been my motivation for putting together Life After Leadership in this webinar, was really to take a step back. A lot of the work that I've done with Tracy Foundation and Tom Adams, my former business partner and colleague, and folks that I've worked with over the years, they've focused a lot on the board of directors, and that's really good, a good place to focus on. The board does, hire the chief executive, but we really haven't. We've paid scant attention to the departing CEO, and so that's really what I wanted to do with this webinar, with the website, and also with the book that I'm writing on Life After Leadership. And So the ideas I'm going to be sharing with you today come from that 20 years of practice experience, but also a lot of research along the way. A few years back, I had the opportunity to participate with a group from around the country. About 20 of us got together for almost 2 years periodically and pooled our knowledge about executive transitions and succession, and came up with a tool we call executive transition management, a 3-phase model for actually managing that transition process when you confront it. But also some work on succession planning. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit more about what you can do as the chief executive, or what your chief executive can do to prepare him or herself and prepare him or your organization for a more successful transition. Also, for the past 2 years, my colleague Molly Kendrick and I have been reviewing, I think we've reviewed at this point something over 400 journal articles and research studies in the field of psychology, social psychology, gerontology, organizational development, executive transitions, trying to glean the best thinking out there around this complicated topic of leave taking and moving into that next chapter of life. And as we'll see, it's going to touch on the organizational preparation, your personal preparation, and also, quite frankly, how you communicate this to your board. So the ideas I'm presenting today are based on really good rock-solid theory and research, but they've also really been tested in practice. So let's dig in. So I'm going to cover 5 points today. First, we're going to explore succession planning and how it impacts organizational sustainability. We'll talk about how to create a more sustainable organization. I know that's something that's on everyone's mind. Second, I'm going to urge you as a chief executive to take charge of your exit, and want to explore with you the 3 roles of the departing executive, which I think you'll find really useful in terms of distinguishing how this time towards the end of your career, towards the end of your tenure with the organization, really is different than maybe the leadership role that you played earlier in your tenure. We're going to take a look at some ideas that you can use to strengthen your organization ahead of the transition as you transition out of the role. And then fourth, we're going to look at how to, so both the personal and professional dimensions of preparing yourself for the transition. So it's not just all about the organization, but how do you get yourself ready? How do you get your kind of your mental game in place for that transition process? And then finally, we're going to take a little bit of a peek at life beyond the transition, life after leadership, and explore some ideas that you might be able to use as you craft your plan for the next chapter of life. So my first point really is that succession impacts sustainability. And so what do we mean? At a fundamental level, succession is deceptively simple. There's you, there's your successor, there's some point where you have a transition, and that's it. You're bopping along in your leadership role, and you decide that you're going to move on, you're going to retire, or you're going to move into a encore career or next job, what have you. And there's a transition. Your successor slips in the role, and everything just kind of moves forward from there, right? Well, not so quick. The senior executive transitions are really complicated, much more complicated than that. These are not your everyday personnel decision where you run a few ads and do a few interviews, select the best person available, and hire them and hope for the best. These jobs are at the pinnacle of the organization, and at this level, they touch just about everything that goes on inside and outside of the organization, and at a very strategic level. And these transitions are especially challenging if they involve a CEO, particularly what we call a hard-to-follow CEO, which is a founder, long-term executive, or transformational leader, somebody that's really, has really transformed the organization. Those are typically hard-to-follow executives, and usually your successor struggles, in some cases struggles mightily trying to succeed you. And another reason why they're challenging is that you really think about it, the hiring that you're doing inside the organization, you're doing it with a great deal of context and skill and background. And, the decision about your successor, particularly if you're a CEO, is going to be made by a board of directors. They're part-time, they're from outside the agency, they probably may not have confronted this decision maybe in a few years. For some of you, probably several decades, if ever. It's maybe the first time that they're hiring a CEO as this board. And so it's pretty challenging stuff for them. It takes time to get them up to speed, to where they can really make a smart hire and a smart hiring decision. And, what happens is that boards frequently get it wrong. They end up firing or forcing out the new executive, and obviously comes at huge cost to the agency and mission work of the agency, but also the lives of the individuals involved. Or they make a not so smart hire and the organization kind of languishes under kind of lackluster leadership. Well, why? Well, even the best board. And I've worked with boards that were absolutely stellar, and I've worked with boards that were not so much. And I can tell you that they always struggle with it. This is a unique moment in time, and it really does take them some time to get prepared. And so that's really what I urge you is to consider how you can give them the gift of that time to really make sure that there's some solid preparation. Another reason that they don't understand the complexity of these jobs. I've worked with boards where invariably at the end of the process, when we've done a recruitment project with the board, invariably at the end they say, "Wow, I had no idea this job was so complicated." And so you really need to give them a little bit of a taste and a little bit of flavor of that. Another reason why these successions fail, or these transitions fail rather, is because the departing executive doesn't give the board enough time, and the board kind of panics and rushes to make a decision, rushes through the process, and they make a not so smart hire because they're scrambling to fill a position. And my big argument is that give them some time. These positions, these transitions require some really careful preparation. A little bit of planning can go a long way to cut that risk factor, as I talked about earlier, cut it in half, up to 2/3 in some cases. So what do you need? You need an exit strategy. That's why we suggest that you prepare an exit strategy. It prepares yourself, prepares the organization for your retirement or your departure, and also to address the communications process. So my second point is about taking charge of your exit. And taking charge of your exit involves sorting out the differences between timing and readiness, both organizational readiness as well as your personal and professional timing. I'll explain that further when we get as we go along in the webinar here. Second, when I talk about exit strategies, I'm not necessarily talking about a single plan. I'm really talking about probably what's a package of plans. Think of an exit strategy less than a plan and more of a framework for approaching your exit and the transition process. And then finally, in this section, we're going to talk about the 3 roles of the departing executive. So let's first take a look at that timing. A really well-managed CEO or senior executive transition involves both readiness of the individual as well as readiness of the organization. You can look at readiness a variety of different ways. Timing certainly influences it. You start getting some gray hair like I've got here, and you start thinking about retirement someday. And that certainly starts to influence things. You also get those messages from people around you that it might be time. Our thinking about retirement is still kind of fossilized now at age 65. Not everyone retires at 65, but about half people do that are eligible for retirement. So you start getting those messages from folks around you, kind of expectations. And the other things that, in terms of timing, that can influence this is the organizational timing. If you're got a big grant or a big contract that's up for renewal, before that decision is made is obviously not a good time, to think about the transition. But maybe fairly soon afterwards, or you've got a big campaign going on to build a new building or launch services in a new county or something like that. That's probably not a great time either. So organizational timing can, influence that, but it can also speed it up too. You may decide that, looking at that, that change ahead, that you may want to kind of speed up your plans a little bit because it would actually be better, for your successor to be making those decisions or have that opportunity. So organizational readiness also, we're going to touch on this a little bit farther when we get into what it really means to have an organization that's ready. But it's kind of the state of the organization, like strength of your board, strength of the board leadership, all those things could kind of enter into it. So but right now, let me just say that those two things work together to influence the transition. And as I said earlier, we're not talking about one plan, but probably several plans. And thinking about this as a succession strategy or an exit strategy as a framework. We talked about, or I showed a slide earlier with the succession timeline. It's not a singular event. There's actually a process that takes place. Obviously, there is a handoff, that takes place in a certain point in the future. But there is some activity that can take place ahead of that to prepare the organization and get it ready. So let me pop this slide up here and kind of explain what I mean here. Really truly, an executive transition takes a minimum of 1 year. It takes about 6 months to do the search and selection process, and it takes about 6 months for your successor, even if they're hired from inside the agency, really to kind of get their full sea legs under them. So it's a year minimum. You back up from that and say, okay, well, the board needs some time to get its act together, maybe hire a search consultant, get itself up to speed, so I can really kind of take this job on with, full gusto. You add, several months onto that. And, all total, it usually is a multi-year, process. And so on this slide here, what I've done is I've distinguished between kind of what we call the sustaining activities, the transitioning activities, and the taking charge process. So what do I mean by each of these things? Well, first of all, the sustaining activities, ideally, in an ideal world, you'd have a couple years ahead of your retirement to get the organization ready, to make sure that you've got the right board leadership in place to manage the transition and succession process, get them up to speed, really get them comfortable with the decision. And then for that next year, or for the year ahead of the transition process, I refer to that as the transitioning period. This is really where they're doing the hardcore planning work for the transition, getting the search launched, making the selection, getting that person, your successor under contract, and so forth. And then the following that is the kind of the taking charge process. So that's really kind of the full transition timeline. But at a minimum, it takes about a year for that process to take place, as I said earlier. 4 to 6 months to execute the search, and probably about 6 months for your successor to get his or her sea legs under him. So let's take a look at the jobs, the 3 jobs of the departing executive. So obviously the first job for the executive is managing the organization, leading the organization. But the second job really is to prepare the organization for that transition process. Is the organization sustainable without you in the picture? Invariably, when I've done successions, and particularly with founders and long-term and transformational executives, and we sit down and do a process with them that we call unpacking the job, invariably there's 4 or 5 jobs, in there, because you just build up a certain level of competency and grace and ease in the position over the years that your successor, even if they're hired from inside the agency, is probably not going to have. And so you want to take a look at how many jobs are packed in there, and maybe you ought to think about, delegating some of those jobs, or getting them, out of there. And sometimes, quite frankly, a lot of times, the longer a person's been in the position, a lot of times the more idiosyncratic the job is to their particular talents and interests. And so, you may find that, when you sit down and take a look at the job, that there are things there that, your successors, it probably may not even be a doable job, if you keep all that stuff in there. So my encouragement is, first of all, take a look at the job with a real critical eye and whether or not it is doable by a successor. Now, I talked a little bit about the sustaining activities, but, what we're really talking about there is building some of the organization's capacity. And, for some of you, that may be kind of a dirty term or kind of a charged term. But I tell you, I worked with over 100 organizations, and I haven't seen an over-resourced nonprofit yet. There's always places where you're, making do, getting by, just because that's just the nature of the business. You never have enough money to do everything, that you want to do. And so, and your particular, leadership skills, you may be able to kind of hold that area together. For example, it might be propping up a member of your team that's, on balance, maybe subpar, or maybe not be the right person for that job, but you make it work because of your particular interest in that area or talent or your fundraising prowess or whatever it is. So you really want to kind of take a real critical look at the agency from the standpoint of, if I'm not in the role, is this organization sustainable? And sometimes when you start, taking that person out, the gears don't quite mesh together as they should when you drop the new person in. So you really want to take a look at that very, very critically. And so what we're looking at in terms of organizational sustainability, let me just touch on there are 4 things that are really, I found in my research, that really make for a sustainable organization. Number 1 is it's got a really good, solid business model. And what I mean by business model is that it's the way the organization creates value in the world and how it funds that value creation process. And I know that's kind of abstract, but really, what do you do and how you get paid for doing it. And also a good, solid business strategy that positions the organizations into the future and positions it in the marketplace. So those 2 things together are really at the top of my list for creating a sustainable organization. Second, backing that up is leadership, both board and executive leadership. Is your board a high-value asset to the organization? Are they really covering the 3 governance roles of a nonprofit organization, or are they just kind of coasting along, sitting in the back of the bus enjoying the sunshine while driving the bus? And that happens a lot with a lot of organizations. So you really want to take a critical look at that. You also want to take a critical look, as I mentioned earlier, your senior leadership team and whether or not you've got the right people on the bus for that team. Third, we look at the organization's resources. And by resources, I'm not talking just about financial. To me, your finances are almost an artifact. They're an artifact of intention, attention, and action. And so what we really want to look at is, do you have the fundamental building blocks in place that are going to really underpin the future of the organization? Your reputational capital. Who are you known as in the community? And what's the community saying about you? Your team capital. How competent your team is and how well they're working together. Systems capital. You have strong systems in place. It's one of the things I saw when I studied high vitality organizations a few years back, is that these folks were consummate capital builders, and not just financial capital, although that's important too. So paying attention to some of those other soft capital items. And then fourth and finally is the organization's culture. Is the culture resilient? Is it forward focused? Or do you bounce back? Are you adaptive? Is the organization really can be characterized as a resilient organization? So a little bit about the kind of that sustaining phase, some of the things that you can do to really strengthen the organization. Unpack your job and make sure that your job is doable for a successor, getting those pieces in place that would make it more doable. And second of all, making sure that your organization is sustainable, focusing on those 4 areas of business model, leadership, resources, and culture. Okay? So let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about the next job of the executive, the the third job of the departing executive, and that really is to prepare yourself. And preparing yourself really begins with a timeline. It begins with making a decision about a departure date and sticking with that decision. It might be a date certain like June 30th, 2014, or it might be a date range like fall of 2015. But it's important to have a date because without it, you really can't plan effectively. And also, quite frankly, when folks, particularly when folks are of a certain age, and there's probably a lot of wondering about, when you plan to leave and what that departure timeline looks like, because folks are worried. Particularly if you're a strong, charismatic leader or highly effective executive, folks worry about whether or not they're going to have a job or whether the agency is going to survive. They've invested a lot in this organization too, and so they're worried about that. And so you owe it to them to be as clear as possible about that. When the two watchwords I would encourage you to think about when you're talking about, particularly about your staff, is empathy and assurance. Empathy that they're kind of there with you. They're being able to provide some feedback on the transition process, and assurance that you've got a good rock solid game plan, and that really begins with a clear departure timeline. So one of the questions that comes up usually at this point is, how far in advance should I let my board know? And my response is typically at least a year. Ideal scenario, at least a year. Why? Well, I laid it out earlier. It's going to take them 4 to 6 months to do the search, and it's going to take them probably a few months to get their act together and get themselves up to speed on the organization. And so you're really talking probably about a year-long process ahead of the transition. And the ideal scenario would be maybe 2-3 years ahead of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of calibrating the timing when we talk about communications in a moment. So let's talk about putting it all together here. This is kind of the whole shebang here in terms of the transition timeline and the two jobs working together, and that handoff and write-off to the next chapter of life. For some of you, you may decide that you want to stick with the organization for a while. You may decide that you want to kind of do what is called a phased retirement. We'll talk about that in a little bit, where you have an ongoing role with the organization, or you may, be taking a different position within the agency. All I suggest that you do is you really make sure that it works for your successor. If it doesn't work for your successor, it doesn't work for the agency, and so it's probably not a good idea. For the same reason, I don't suggest that you go on the board of directors. Boards kind of freak out when executives decide to leave, and they want to try and hedge their bets about their successor, and so they think by having you around, that's got to be part of hedging their bet. Or they may just, appreciate you and want to have you, stay with the family, so to speak. And all those are good motivations. But the one thing that I always point to is that you probably don't recognize how much of a power shadow you cast. And so you want to make sure that your power shadow doesn't overshadow your successor. And so I'd approach any kind of ongoing relationship with the organization with some caution. If for it to work, it's got to work for your successor. So have some check-ins in there built into the contractual process, that sort of thing, to make sure that it really does work. So let's shift gears here and talk about preparing your organization. So as I said, earlier in the executive preparation process, it usually involves some assessment. In this case, assessment of the organization's readiness. Obviously, I'm an advocate for telling the board as early as possible, trying to give them at least 2-3 years of prep time so you can do some sustainability planning work with the organization, but probably a year minimum. And I'm not going to get into the whole transition planning process. There's quite a number of books out there on that. There's also a guide from the partnership free on the training website that Cashin will point you to later that covers both sustainability planning, actually covers sustainability planning, executive transition management, as well as succession planning. So let's take a look at organizational readiness and what are some of the factors there. So one of the things is, as I said earlier, is the organization sustainable without you in the position? Do you have some potential internal successors that might be available for the board to consider? Do you have some succession plans in place that kind of has built up the kind of the board's competency around transition? What can you do to help build the board's competency? Do you have the right leadership in place to manage the transition? So again, if you've got a couple of years and you've got a relatively weak board, you might want to think about trying to recruit some board members that may be a little stronger, have a little bit more experience with executive transitions, so forth, to kind of strengthen the team. I tell you, I've done 100 of these things, more than 100 of them, and boy, good board leadership makes all the difference in the world in terms of outcomes and in terms of just being able to, manage the process. So I'd say, pay attention to that. Make sure that you've got the right board leadership in place. And then the staff, do you have the right skills on the team? As I mentioned earlier, do you have the right team that you really want to leave your successor, or are you kind of, propping up, somebody along the way? So take a look at that. Is it structured for the future, and do they have some transition competency? Do they understand the nature of transitions, and are they prepared to help with the onboarding process with your successor? So I think we have a quick poll here. See if you have a written succession plan in place. So over on the right-hand panel, yes, no, or you're not sure, or don't know.
Yes, and that is open there. We have a couple of answers coming in, and we will keep it open for a few more seconds to gather those answers. All right, you do have about 10 more seconds or so to put in your answers on yes, no, or not sure to having a written succession plan.
For some of you may not be sure what we mean by succession plan. It actually covers quite a bit of territory, so while we're waiting for the poll to complete, there's if you go onto the partnerships website, there's in the training area, there is a guide that we wrote last year that covers what we call succession essentials. And that really is an emergency backup plan or a backup plan for the chief executive position, although you can use that planning framework for other positions as well. And then there's also what we call a board-adopted succession policy. And those two things kind of work together to ensure kind of continuity of leadership under a variety of different circumstances, whether it's you decide to leave the organization next year, the board has been worked through kind of that process, or also, quite frankly, if for those emergency situations, if you were temporarily unavailable to leave the agency, or God forbid, if you were permanently unavailable to leave the agency, what would they do? And so it lays out step by step how the board would handle that process. It's a great tool for building board's transition competency. If you did one thing only, and had that what we call succession essentials, that backup plan for the executive and the companion succession policy, you do a great service to your board in terms of really helping them, build that transition competency that I referenced earlier. Well, it looks like about 60% of you aren't sure if you've got one in place, and about 40% of you say yes. Well, that's good. That's great. Congratulations to the 40%. You're ahead of the curve. Nationally, nonprofits, only about 17% of nonprofit organizations have a succession plan in place for their chief executive position. The other flavors of succession planning, before we move on to preparing yourself, as we kind of wrap up here talking about preparing the organization, another couple flavors of succession planning, in addition to what we call succession essentials, those two documents in the process of working through them, are what typically is referred to as talent development, leader development, talent management. And it's about assessing your team. Usually works better in larger organizations, assessing the team and putting some developmental plans in place so that they are advancing their skill set. Talent management, a little more complicated than that, but kind of in a nutshell in terms of leader development. That's typically how we work with it. And then there's also a flavor called departure defined succession planning, and really it's kind of what we're talking about here when we're talking about exit planning. Well, so let's shift gears here and talk about the fourth point, and that really is preparing yourself. So preparing yourself is similar to preparing an organization. Usually it involves some assessment work, assessment of your personal and professional readiness to move on, followed by some exploration of your career options and doing some strategic planning, personal strategic planning around that. And then finally sorting out the departure communications, particularly how and when you're going to tell your board of directors. So executive readiness, there's that matrix again. Really involves the timing, committing to a date, and sorting out the communications process. And I'm going to cover communications more in depth in a moment. But for now, let's just recognize that your role is really going to evolve, particularly if you're taking charge of your exit and focusing on the 3 jobs that I outlined earlier. There may be parts of the work where you need to kind of loosen up a little bit and let leadership emerge around you. A lot of executives think they need to lead, and then boom, they're out the door. But probably a better approach is to think about it being more of a glide path, that you're letting the board take charge of the succession process, not blindly, with your support, with your input, but really giving them the space to kind of step up, and take charge, because quite frankly, you're going to leave one day and they're going to be sitting there with your successor, and they're going to be looking at each other and saying, what do we do now? And so what you really want to do during this process is help them get ready, so they're not looking at each other and asking, what are we going to do now? They know exactly what they're going to do. They know that they're going to need to create a powerful partnership with your successor. They've got some tools and competency to do that. Another thing that you want to take a look at is kind of your unfinished business or unfinished agenda. I hear this a lot from departing executives that, gosh, this really isn't a great time because I've got this thing on the horizon or that thing on the horizon, or I really want to do this yet, or I really would like to put this in place for the agency. You know what? That's just a sign of good leadership. That's what leadership is for, is to make things happen for the agency. And so, you're probably always going to have something, if you're really, a vital leader, you're always going to have something, on your agenda. And so, that may be just something that you need to kind of gift over to your successor, and accept the fact that, it may be time to leave. And yep, I do have a few things, but, I've taken care of the major stuff. And, there's oftentimes when I work with executives, kind of 2 schools of thought that kind of guide this process. Particularly in terms of personal preparation, there are people who, don't want to think about it until they're actually retired and kind of have that freedom. My wife is a psychotherapist, and she's in that category. Her motto is you got to take a month off for every year that you work. And, I'm of the planning school of thought and think that you ought to have a game plan, before you move into retirement. So, probably both strategies work, but there's probably some things that, that you might want to have in place. I'm going to talk about the success factors in a moment here. that you want to have in place. So, well, actually, let me just go ahead and jump into that. Those success factors. I studied. I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of research looking at retirement in particular. And what we found is that the people that are happiest in retirement have 4 things in place. They have certainly some financial security. They have a decent combination of income coming in from Social Security, from their pension, from their 403B plan, from savings, maybe in some cases a part-time or a bridge job. So certainly the financial piece is one of it, but there's 3 other things that people often overlook, and it's something that I think is as important as good financial planning is some of these other factors. Other factors that contribute to success in retirement and satisfaction in retirement is your social circle. I talk with I'm interviewing executives for my book, and I hear from so many executives that they're stunned that after they retired, they realized how much their social circle was tied to their work environment, and their colleagues are still, working, or they're not available, and they're kind of feeling like they're kind of adrift out there. And so you want to make sure, David Corbett wrote a wonderful book a few years back called Rebalancing Your Portfolio, the portfolio of life, rather. And it's really about balancing your life portfolio, making sure that you've got, just as you would balance your financial portfolio, that you balance your life portfolio. And I think that is a great, really apt metaphor here, really making sure that you've got a good, strong social circle in place. The other 2 factors that enter into it is the fact that they're, that you're emotionally ready to move on. And what I found is that it's very, very hard for an executive, particularly a leader, to move on unless they've got what I call a moving on project, a moving toward project. And what do I mean by that? Really something that you're excited about, that you're going to do in the next chapter of life. It might be a bridge job. It might be throwing yourself at your hobbies. It might be traveling, whatever it is. That there's something that you're really excited about and looking forward to. So having that social circle in place, having that that moving on project, and having financial. The 4th thing, and this is something that you can work on your well-being, but you are basically kind of granted your health. But the people that were happiest in retirement were folks that were also healthy, had their health, and they were working on maintaining their well-being. So you really want to look at all 4 of those things, and I encourage you to start working on that while you're still in your position. Building your social circle is going to make a whole heck of a lot easier, in your current environment than it is after you retire. Phone calls don't get returned as quick as, from what I've been told from some of the executives that have retired. And so you really want to make sure that you're starting to kind of build those social networks that you can kind of move into. Maintaining getting your health checked out, and maintaining your well-being. There's a theory called continuity theory that says that basically the person that you are before you retire is the person that you're going to be in retirement. So my motto is build that person now, move into retirement with kind of that momentum behind you of financial, emotionally, and socially prepared to move on. So let's jump over to and talk about communications, and then I'm going to go back to touch on the 5th point, which is about exploring what's next, kind of looking at life after leadership. So on this chart here, what I've done is I've outlined kind of the major chunks of the communications process. And these processes usually begin with some really private, speculation on the part of the executive. And you're usually not talking with anybody unless it maybe is kind of a close circle of trusted advisors, maybe your spouse, maybe, a colleagues or that have retired, but usually not a big announcement. And the disclosure process usually begins with a conversation with the board chair. I'll tell you what I find that is the big determining factor here that really influences timing is trust. The trust level that you have with your board chair, trust level that you have, with your board of directors. And what I find that the reason why executives put off telling their board and therefore, oftentimes compress that time frame that the board has to prepare the organization and execute the search is fear. Fear of becoming a lame duck, fear that the board will act precipitously and maybe try to, force you out prematurely or something along those lines. In most cases, those fears are unfounded. A good executive is not going to be a lame duck. There are things that are going to be kind of postponed, for your successor, but that's probably, only natural. That, the good executive is really going to lead the organization. Folks are going to know who's in charge right up to the final day. The same token, with the board, can you trust your board to, act, appropriately with information? And I'll tell you what makes a big difference is having this game plan laid out for them, having some material, going over to the partnership's website, taking a look at the the value of that sustainability planning guide that we all put together. Maybe doing some putting some succession policy in place that walks them through the process. So it's not like this, oh my God, big hairy process. We've got to replace this incredible executive, but kind of breaking it down so they see it's a step by step. It's a project that can be managed, and so that'll go a long way to reducing their anxiety and getting them, feel more comfortable about the transition process. So, look, I mean, only your board, and your level of trust. So let that be your guide. But my encouragement is to try and be as generous with them as possible in terms of the time frame. So if you're looking for some additional guidance on that, we've got some materials on that at lifeafterleadership.com. So let's talk about exploring what's next, the final point in this webinar. So one of the things I'd like to kind of point out that if you're approaching age 65 or already beyond that milestone, you probably have gotten some messages about retirement. And, as I said earlier, our thinking about retirement as a society is still kind of fossilized around the notion of age 65. That's kind of creeping upward, but it's still kind of the accepted milestone. If you retire too early, people are suspicious about it. If you hang on too long, sometimes people are suspicious about it. But the great news is there's never been a better, time on our planet to be an older person than, in some of the industrialized countries, the United States included, at this particular time in our history. Life expectancy has been continuing to creep up over the years. And, in 1940, a person retiring at age 65 could look to about 14 years of life expectancy. That's now, somewhere around 20 years. A little bit more better for women, a little bit shorter for men, but, roughly 20 years. So the question is, what are you going to do with these bonus years that you've got? And so let's take a look at some options to kind of explore that. So obviously, if you want to continue to work, you're going to be in good company. About half of the oldest baby boomers lack sufficient resources to cover their basic retirement expenses and uninsured health costs in retirement. So there's going to be a number of folks that are going to have to work. So if you're among those, you're going to be in good company. About 8 out of 10 baby boomers said that they wanted to work at least part-time. And specifically the nonprofit sector, the recent poll conducted by the folks at encore.org found that about 95% of nonprofit leaders just completely reject the whole, golden years, let's spend time on the golf course every day on the golf course kind of approach. And about 60% of them said that they plan to work at least until 70. But the reality is that about half of eligible Americans do retire right around age 65. Look, the labor force participation, it usually drops off by about half between that cohort that's 60 to 64 and the 64 to 69 cohort. So a lot of people do retire. But the question is, how do you retire? And so there's lots of different ways that you might want to do that. Certainly there's, the full-time jump right into retirement. But then there's also what we refer to as phased retirement. This might be a situation where you're working part-time for your current employer up to, your date of retirement. You're working under declining hours, and so you're easing out of the role, maybe as an internal successor, it's easing into the role. There's also, in terms of phased retirement, there's also kind of post-retirement engagements. That might be a contract with the organization to act as an advisor to your successor over maybe the coming months or coming year even. I've seen those contracts as long as a year. As I said earlier, it might involve moving into a different role in the organization. The value in doing something with your current organization, as I mentioned earlier, proceed with some caution because, it really has to work for your successor for it to work for the organization. But on the other hand, the value to you is that research points to that usually the income level is higher by sticking around with your current organization than it is to moving another, or certainly is higher if you're kind of staying in the same field. But having that kind of phased retirement is a very common strategy. Another couple options that are kind of related to each other would be an encore career. This is, typically the purists around encore careers say, oh, it's a separate phase of life, and so it really is moving from this career to that career over there. So it might involve career recycling, where you're kind of taking taking some of the skills that you developed in your current role, and maybe you're doing a social entrepreneur project elsewhere, or some private entrepreneurship. Maybe you've really been a great, developer, a housing developer, and you're going to go take those skills and go out on the private sector and develop houses, or something along those lines. So career recyclers, and then there's people that are just kind of they've taken a lifelong interest. Maybe they've got a hobby or something that that they can turn into a full-time or part-time activity in retirement. My brother did that. My brother was a supervisor for a dairy. He supervised their cooler operation and the loading of the trucks and so forth. And worked for there for 37 years, and he always had this kind of knack for or interest in video. And so one of his things was when he retired was to videotape weddings. So what is it that you have that's in your portfolio that maybe you kind of pushed off into the corner that you can kind of bring to the fore in your retirement years? And the final strategy I want to touch on is what's called bridge employment. And what I mean by that is that fairly common practice is for people to do a bridge job. You may not necessarily be ready to jump into full-time retirement, but you take a job somewhere, or kind of a takeoff on the encore career idea. But maybe you've really been a good fund developer and resource developer, and you take a part-time gig with one of your nonprofit colleague organizations, something along those lines. So there's lots of different ways of approaching that. But one thing I would tell you from our research is that the people who are working, quote unquote, working in retirement, the folks that either have a highly engaged retirement, where they're really throwing themselves into their hobby, their travel, or something that they're really passionate about, or the people that are working either part-time or full-time in retirement, are generally mentally and physically healthier than their counterparts that just kind of go into retirement cold turkey and are trying to figure out what to do with themselves. So again, I mentioned earlier, kind of rebalancing your portfolio, getting some of those things in place. I encourage you to think about that. What can you do to kind of line yourself up to have that really actively engaged kind of post-career time? So I touched on this earlier, the retirement success factors. Just kind of want to kind of reinforce them again, that from our research and everything that we've read about the interviews and so forth, that the folks that are happiest in retirement are relatively healthy and are actively working on maintaining their well-being. They've got a post-career project that they're really excited about. something that they really enjoy and that gets them moving every day. Third, they really have meaningful engagement with their social circle, that they have somebody in their lives to whom they matter and who matter to them. One of my former, I guess I would call him former colleague and also a business partner at one point, retired about 14 years ago, and he has a schmooze group, they call it, a bunch of guys, about 10 of them, that invariably, some subset of them gets together every Saturday morning from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And they have, they have a meal together. They kind of do a potluck thing together. But invariably, they get together every Saturday, and it really provides this wonderful space for them to kind of come to resolution about the issues of aging. Somebody once said that aging isn't for sissies, and it's probably true. If these folks are any testament. So, you're going to have the physical frailties. You're going to have these spats for your spouse. There's lots of things that are going to happen. And for these guys, they have the opportunity to get together and kind of, get resolution, or at least ventilate for a while, has been very powerful and very important. And it's really been fascinating to watch these guys really be vital and actively engaged with each other. And then fourth and finally, the financial security and a comfortable level of income, either from Social Security, pensions, savings, drawdowns on your 403B plan, or what have you. So we're heading towards the home stretch here. So what's next? Well, go make it happen. The things that I would recommend that you do is, first of all, sort out your timeline and commit to a date. Second, engage the board as early as possible. Third, really assess your organization's capacity and its sustainability. Again, without you in place, is the organization sustainable? What can you do to strengthen your board, strengthen the organization's business model, its resources, or your team capacity? Fourth, accept that fact that you're going to have an evolving role. Support, but don't control. Make sure that the board is really fully empowered and fully informed and really ready to take charge of the transition process, because they're going to be stuck with your successor, and you want to make sure that they really are geared up and primed for them to powerfully contract with your successor. I don't mean the kind of the literal contract, I mean the social contract, that board executive relationship. For many of you, you're the only CEO they've known, this board's known. And so you really want to kind of make sure that they're starting to think about what it's going to be like to hire a new person. What kind of work do they want to do? What kind of partnership do they want to have that person? Fifth, focus on those personal success factors that I mentioned earlier. That you've got that balanced portfolio, and as I mentioned earlier, working on that now, beginning to take those actions to build your social security, build your well-being, all those kinds of things. As I said earlier, continuity theory suggests that the person you are when you retire is the person you're going to be in retirement. So start building that person that you want to be right now. And then finally, manage the emotions and the drama around you. So these transitions, really elicit a wide range of emotions from people. People freak out a little bit, and William Bridges, this wonderful author, has really dedicated his life to helping organizations and people deal with transitions. And he makes a distinction between change versus transition. Change is what happens in the physical realm, and transition is that psychological coming to terms with what that change, means. And I tell you, the natural human reaction to change is usually along the lines of, what am I going to lose here? That's how your staff's probably going to react to it. That's how folks around you are probably going to react to it. So again, having some of these, having thought this through, having a game plan, being able to provide that empathy and assurance that I mentioned earlier is really going to stand you in good stead. And then finally, the importance of communications, keeping people apprised of the progress of the search and the transition process will go a long way to alleviating people's concerns. So finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some resources. I mentioned earlier that there are these 3 toolkits available from the partnership. on their website. Certainly invite you to visit lifeafterleadership.com. Lots and lots of free resources there, and we'll, some of these issues are taken to a much deeper level around exit planning. And then finally, also I invite you to contact me directly. We're going to open up here for questions. I'm going to put the slide up on the screen, so if any of you want to write down my phone number or my email address, I welcome your call. I welcome your emails. So let's open it up for questions. How can I help you?
Sure, and to put in questions, there is a Q&A box on that right side panel, so if you could go ahead and type in your questions there, we will be glad to take them as they come in. And while you are thinking about those, I just wanted to actually take it back for a moment and wanted to share with everyone how to get to those resources that we were just mentioning there. You should be able to see then on your screen here momentarily the CSBG T&TA Resource Center. That is at www.csbgtta.org. I would like to point out this is actually relatively new. You can get to the Consultant Bank calendar and Resource Bank without having to log in any longer. So if you go through the Resource Bank, you can search through our library where you will find those 3 toolkits that were mentioned, as well as the recording for this particular event and any of the other webinars we've done. You can also find that information from the Partnership's website. You come over here to either the National Training Center tab or the Resources tab, either one. You can see all of those toolkits and webinars as well. It does break down half the navigation for you. If you go down here to toolkits, you'll see the breadth of different work that we've done through the last couple of cooperative agreements to the Office of Community Services, including this 3-piece set, preparing for your community action agency's future, sustainability, succession, and transition. That is that 3-part guide to talk about the sustainability planning. The executive succession planning, that's the one that does have some of the templates in there, as well as executive transition. So we do suggest that you take a look at these resources there. With that, I am not seeing that many questions coming in, so if you do come up with any questions later on, do not hesitate to email us here at the Partnership. We'll answer them or pass them along as needed, or you can reach out directly to Ms. Debbie here to put his contact information up. So with that, any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave everyone with?
I just would like to say thank you, and thank you to all of you on the call today or on the webinar today, and for what you do and what you contribute to our world. You really do make a huge impact, and but know that there are people ready to to step in behind you, and so it's need to show them the way, and that's what the exit planning is all about. And I thank you for what you do, and as I said, I certainly would invite you to reach out to me if you were shy about raising your hand on the call through today. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm delighted to help.
All right, with that then we will finish up. There will be an evaluation that'll pop up on your screen after we close today's event, so we do appreciate your participation in that. Let us know what you thought about today's event, as well as what your suggestions are, what else you would like to see from the Partnership on future events. So let us know. And with that, have a good afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, Cashin.